So we're looking at Unit 5 and Learning Outcome 3, which is be able to implement the minimum core in planning inclusive teaching and learning. And we're going to do 3.1 and 3.2, which is analyze ways in which minimum core elements can be demonstrated in planning inclusive teaching and learning, and then apply minimum core elements in planning inclusive teaching and learning. I actually made a note that I want to talk to you about a little bit later as well. Let me just see if I can find it. I used so many post-its, and then, yes, I've got it here. We'll have a little chat about this at the end. Let's go onto here. So what is minimum core? Like, we've gone over this in the past few units. So you know minimum core is when you're embedding literacy, language, numeracy, and ICT. And these things are just embedded in a way that you don't even really realize that you're doing it on a daily basis, where you'll have spelling tests, you'll number your spellings, you might use iPads for researching how to stay safe on the internet and so on. So lots of different things. You know, we've talked about this a few times. We refer to them as English, maths, and digital skills. And the more you get used to doing this, the better you get at this. So it becomes second nature for you to just sort of include them in. So on to 3.1, which is analyze ways in which minimum core elements can be demonstrated in planning inclusive teaching and learning. So because this is an analysis, when you do answer this, and I do say this later on in the tips section, is make sure that you're talking about the benefits and the disadvantages of these, because that's what we need to do for an analysis. So there's a lot of different ways that we can embed minimum core into our planning. So when we're planning our lessons, or we're creating schemes of work or lesson plans, we can actually plan in advance of how we're going to do minimum core. Now, depending on what minimum core you're going to do, that'll be up to you, depending on your group of learners. If you want to put in a little bit of counting with your English classes, if you want to do a bit of a recap using English language skills where you're having a conversation, or if you just want to do a phonics activity using an iPad. So it's quite a lot of different ways that you can do this. Now, the activities that you use actually give you a lot of flexibility to address any gaps that your learners might have, and then also adapt for them, so that you can actually use different techniques, different skills, so that you can make sure that you're differentiating your lessons and you're doing them in a way that will be beneficial for your learners. So there's a lot of activities that you can use, and some of these activities are just things like you would do on a normal basis, to be honest. So things like workshops, you might do practical tasks, you might want to do some research, project work, case studies. You might want to play some games on your interactive whiteboard, you know, where they're coming up, they're touching things at lunchtime, they're reordering things, they're learning how to count using videos, especially that number song. I love that. Counting in fives, counting in tens. If you've in year one, you probably have heard it a few times. Yeah. And then you're there dancing along with it with the kids, you know. So they're doing a lot of different things. They're using technology, they're using numbers, they're interactive because there's, you know, you're actually physically moving along with it. So there's a whole lot of things that you can use. When you are using any activities that you use, and it will be age appropriate, depending on every setting will have a different type of activity that they'll go towards, or certain type of tasks that they'll want to do. Like if you were to go and ask your primary school students to go and write a 3,000-word essay, it wouldn't work. So you adapt it depending on their age. So when you're doing this, you've got to make sure that the teaching materials you use and the language you use and the variety of activity that you use is actually at an appropriate level. So if you were to come to me and say, Afsha, I want you to go and make me a poster, and that's it, go make me a colourful poster, and your unit is done. And that would be a little bit too simple for an adult to do. So I'd go away and make a poster and say, here you go, how do we stay safe in the internet? I've not explained anything. I've just probably done an hour's worth of work, less than that. So you've got to make sure that it's appropriate. So when you're planning lessons, you should consider the three following things. So the use of clear, spoken, and written language when you're giving instructions. This can be quite hard to do, and I sometimes find that especially when I'm making PowerPoints or doing resources, or I like to do a lot of assignment tip documents as well. What I write and what I think I'm writing, it seems simple to me, but when I'm actually trying to explain it to my students, it gets lost in translation. So this can be a little bit difficult to master, and it's something that I'm still working on as well, adapting it as I go along.
Mm-hmm.
So you've got to look at using developing activities that promote literacy, language, numeracy, and ICT alongside any subject specialist skills. So if you're doing a science lesson, you want to learn about measuring things. Obviously, you're going to teach them about how to measure things, make sure they're not spilling any items, and they're being safe using protective equipment at that same time as well. But also, you're going to want to promote your minimum core in it. Now, naturally, we tend to go for the same old tasks and the same old activities, which it can seem fun for learners to start off with, but after a while, if they're doing the same old thing, it gets boring. So we've got to work on developing new types of activities. And that can be quite daunting at first, because when you do go and you're like, oh, there's too much effort into this, I'm going to have to use so many extra resources and so on, but it's worth it. And then you also need to consider the needs of those learners that have specific learning difficulties and disabilities, or if they've got sensory impairments. I've actually got an example of how you could do that. Oh, did I not put that example in? I didn't put the example in. I thought I had. But the example of that is, if there's a learner with a sensory impairment, you might want to adapt an activity where they're physically doing something. So they might have a feely bag where they're putting their hands in, actually, if they're visually, if they can't see, if they're visually impaired, they could put their hand in and actually feel different materials or different objects. And that is you getting them in a different activity for them as well. So we're going to go on to the tips section. So like I said earlier, because this is an analysis, you need to put down the advantages and disadvantages. So start off with identifying the different ways minimum core can be used to demonstrate planning. So how would you plan, talk about how you input ICT, numeracy, English into your activities. Like when you're thinking about doing role plays or case studies or practical assignments, how you embed that. Then go on to discuss the benefits and disadvantages. So some benefits of embedding minimum core when you're planning is that it caters for different learning styles and learning needs. And you can use a variety of activities and keep learners engaged. But the disadvantages is that it takes an extremely long time. It's very time consuming to plan. And you might not have all the resources that you want. You might not have enough staff members to be able to implement this. So these are some benefits and some disadvantages on here. I mean, you've been working on your lesson plan, haven't you? Have you been finding that it's quite time consuming to actually do? Geeta, are you still here?
Yeah, I can hear you.
So I was just asking, you've been working on your lesson plan, haven't you, last week?
Yeah.
Has it been an easy task, or has it been like a bit of a mixed one?
Honestly speaking, because it's the first time I'm just going through, so it's not that easy for me to just come on that and start doing it. But yes, I have got an example and I'm doing it.
Yeah.
I haven't finished that yet, but I'm just in the middle of that.
Exactly, because it is, even no matter how experienced you get at these, even when I'm still making lesson plans, they are very time consuming and probably faster than I was when I first did my very first one.
Mm-hmm.
But the thing is, because you're looking at so many different students and you're looking at so many different factors that you're trying to teach and then trying to adapt for it. So the lesson plan itself is fair enough. You write down on a chart, you put down a table what you can do, split it up. But then you've got to actually planning also for your activities. You're creating different adapted worksheets, and this itself can take a lot of time. Brilliant. So do you have any questions for what we've gone over?
No.
Okay.
Isn't it similar like we use the minimum core while teaching?
Yes. Because you've got had that question minimum core in teaching, you've had minimum core in assessment, now you've got minimum core in planning. So it's all about inclusive teaching and learning, but they've just changed the odd word here too. Yeah. So 3.2 is apply minimum core elements in planning inclusive teaching and learning. And you can apply minimum core elements in a number of ways. So these are through the use of, again, they're so similar, they're more or less the same as what you do in 3.1. So if you wanted to, I don't think there'd be an issue with merging both of these questions together, answering one of analysing and then the second of applying. But it might just be a bit too much work. Keeping them separate might be a little bit better. So even though you'll be repeating yourself quite a little bit in both of them, and they'll feel quite similar, keep them separate because that's an analysis and this is an apply. This will also be covered when you do your teaching observations for 3.2. So you're going to use your minimum core through the use of, again, appropriate language in teaching materials. So you don't want to be using too many unfamiliar words for young children, especially in the primary school setting that you're in. You're going to look at their age and stage level and see what they can do. Do you want to say addition, when you're doing maths, or are you just going to write adding? Which one will they understand? Those type of things. Again, so you're planning your language that you're using when you're speaking and writing. You're developing activities that promote literacy, language, and so the minimum core. You're adapting and differentiating your activities, and you probably do this on a daily basis without even realizing it, and you probably do it so often that it's second nature to you now, that you can think on your feet, and afterwards you probably don't even realize you've done it. So you're differentiating your activities. You might notice that as a student that's falling behind, can't keep up. You might split down their questions. You might write down on a whiteboard instead and say, okay, let's work these number ones out together and so on. And here's my example. I knew I'd put it in. And then you've got students that have sensory impairments. How are you going to adapt? So you've got a feely box where you've got different textured objects inside it. They might want to look at rough and smooth numbers and letters and shapes. So by you introducing the numbers or the letters, you're actually doing English and maths within that at the same time. So for here, because this is an apply, you need to use the present tense. This will also be one of the points that is going to be covered when you're doing your observations, like we said. So talk about what minimum core is when you're planning inclusive in teaching and learning. You've already talked about minimum core in 3.1, so you can refer it back to there. And then just talk about how you plan for differentiated activities. How do you include your minimum core within it? You know, things like you're making sure that you're using clear language to promote language and literacy, that you're giving spoken instructions and written instructions, that you're embedding numeracy when you're doing certain tasks. So you might be doing like a timeline, and you'll say, what's the first step? Step number 1, step number 2, step number 3, and going on through there. and that when you're embedding ICT on a daily basis, more or less consistently, because you're using this smart interactive board on a daily basis, aren't you?
Mm.
So there's a whole lot of things that you'll be able to just reflect on while you're working that you do actually use to embed. So do you have any questions in regards to this?
No.
So I'm going to come out of this.